Welcome to Chosen by Love, where fate brings hearts together in the most unexpected ways. Subscribe and join our growing family of story lovers. Tell us where you're watching from, and let's begin today's journey. Sometimes the most dangerous word in a billion-dollar company isn't no. It's enough. At exactly 8 o'clock on a rainy Monday morning, every elevator inside Von Global Tower opened onto the executive floor with the same quiet ritual. People stepped out carrying tablets, leather portfolios, and steaming coffee cups, but the confidence they wore in the lobby disappeared before they reached the glass conference room at the end of the hallway. Conversations faded into whispers. Smiles vanished. Even polished dress shoes seemed to land more softly on the marble floor. There was only one reason for the sudden silence. Alistair Vaughn was already inside. At 34 years old, the billionaire founder and chief executive officer had built one of America's fastest-growing technology empires. But inside his own company he was known for something else entirely. Precision. Discipline. Impossible standards. Some called him a genius. Others called him ruthless. Nobody dared call him either to his face. Employees measured meetings by how many people walked out relieved rather than devastated. His reputation traveled faster than quarterly earnings. Investors admired him. Competitors feared him. His own executives rarely looked him in the eye. Behind the closed glass doors, 20 senior managers sat perfectly still around a walnut conference table that stretched nearly 20 feet long. A digital presentation glowed across the massive screen while New York's skyline disappeared behind sheets of gray rain. Alistair stood at the head of the table in a charcoal suit without a single wrinkle, one hand resting lightly on the polished surface as if the entire room belonged to him. His voice never rose. Never needed to. Explain why the deadline moved from Friday to Tuesday. The marketing director swallowed hard before answering. We encountered unexpected supplier delays, sir. Alistair didn't blink. Did the calendar change? No, sir. Did the client change the agreement? No, sir. Then the deadline never moved. Your execution did. The room became painfully quiet. Nobody reached for coffee. Nobody shifted in a chair. Even the air conditioning sounded too loud. Alistair closed the presentation with a single click. Someone else will lead the project. That was all. No shouting. No insults. Just a decision delivered with absolute finality. The marketing director nodded once, gathered his notebook with trembling hands, and quietly left the conference room. Nobody spoke after the door closed. They simply stared at the table, silently grateful that today the mistake had belonged to someone else. Outside the conference room, Meredith Hale hurried across the executive floor carrying a stack of revised contracts against her chest. It was only her third week at Von Global, and every warning she'd heard echoed through her mind. Never interrupt Mr. Vaughn. Never ask unnecessary questions. Never disagree during meetings. Never make him repeat himself. She had memorized every rule before her first day, but something about those rules had never felt right. Through the transparent glass wall she caught a glimpse of the executives frozen around the table like statues waiting for permission to breathe. She noticed the man who had just left. His shoulders were slumped, not because he had lost an argument, but because he looked as though he had forgotten how to believe in himself. Meredith paused for only a heartbeat before knocking gently. An assistant opened the door and whispered, "The revised contracts." Alistair didn't even turn around. "Bring them." Meredith stepped inside. Every eye followed her. She crossed the room, placed the documents neatly beside him, and prepared to leave when Alistair flipped through the first page. His expression hardened. These figures were approved 6 hours ago. Why are they being revised now? Meredith answered honestly. Accounting found an error that would have cost the client nearly $2 million. He looked at her for the first time. His blue eyes were cold enough to stop conversations before they began. Then accounting failed first. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Meredith glanced toward the empty chair left behind by the former project leader, then back at the billionaire standing inches away. She saw exhaustion hidden beneath flawless composure. She saw a man everyone feared but no one truly spoke to. Before caution could silence her, one quiet word escaped her lips. Enough. The room seemed to forget how sound worked. 20 executives stared at her as if she had shattered every unwritten law inside the building. Even the rain outside felt distant. For the first time anyone could remember, Alistair Vaughn didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at the young woman standing calmly before him, as though she had spoken a language he hadn't heard in years. The silence inside the executive conference room lingered long after Meredith Hale had spoken. Nobody reached for a notebook. Nobody dared clear a throat. 20 experienced executives stared between the young assistant and the billionaire at the head of the table, each person silently expecting the same outcome. Human resources would be called. Security would arrive. The newest employee in the building would disappear before lunch. Instead, Alistair Vaughn continued looking directly at her. His expression revealed nothing, but there was something different in his eyes. It was not anger. It was curiosity, a feeling so unfamiliar that even he seemed uncertain what to do with it. Finally, he closed the folder in front of him. Everyone else may leave. Chairs slid back almost in unison. People collected laptops and tablets with careful hands, avoiding eye contact with either of them. Within seconds the enormous conference room emptied, leaving only Meredith and Alistair standing beneath the gray morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city below continued moving as though nothing extraordinary had happened, but inside the room the atmosphere felt entirely different. Alistair walked toward the glass overlooking Manhattan before speaking again. "Do you know how many people have worked on this floor during the last 5 years?" Meredith answered honestly. "No, sir. Thousands." His reflection remained fixed against the rain-streaked glass. "Do you know how many have interrupted me during a meeting?" She hesitated. "I would guess none." "Correct." He slowly turned toward her. "Then explain why you did." Meredith took a steady breath. Every instinct told her to apologize, but that would have been easier than telling the truth, because everyone stopped thinking the moment they became afraid. The words settled between them. Alistair studied her without speaking. She continued before fear could catch up with her. The mistake had already been identified. The solution had already been found. But everyone in that room looked more concerned about surviving the meeting than helping the company move forward. His face remained unreadable. "You have been here 3 weeks." "Yes." "And you believe you understand this company?" "No." She shook her head gently. "I think I understand people." Another long silence followed. Meredith wondered if she had just ended the shortest professional career of her life. Instead, Alistair walked back to the conference table and gathered the contracts she had delivered. "Be in my office at 8 tomorrow morning." She blinked. "Sir." "Do not make me repeat myself." He picked up his tablet and walked out without another word. By lunchtime the entire executive floor had transformed into a rumor mill. Every department seemed to have its own version of the story. Some insisted Meredith had secretly known the billionaire before joining the company. Others claimed she was related to a board member. One whispered that Mr. Vaughn enjoyed testing employees before dismissing them. Another predicted she would not survive the week. Meredith ignored every conversation and returned to her desk. She had plenty of work waiting, and speculation never completed a spreadsheet. Late that afternoon her supervisor appeared carrying a sealed envelope. Several co-workers quietly looked over their computer screens. Someone even offered a sympathetic smile. Meredith thanked her supervisor, opened the envelope, and unfolded a single sheet of thick white paper. It contained only one sentence. Effective immediately, Meredith Hale is assigned as executive assistant to the Office of the Chief Executive Officer. She read it twice before looking up. The room had gone completely silent again. Her supervisor forced a smile that looked equal parts surprise and disbelief. "Congratulations," she finally managed. "That position has been empty for almost a year." Meredith frowned. "What happened to the last assistant?" The supervisor hesitated before answering. "Nobody stayed long enough to decorate the office." The executive suite occupied the highest floor of the tower. As Meredith rode the private elevator the following morning, she rehearsed every possible explanation for yesterday's impossible decision. None of them made sense. When the doors opened, she found Alistair already standing beside the wall of windows with a cup of untouched black coffee resting on his desk. Without looking away from the skyline, he spoke in the same calm voice that had unsettled an entire corporation. "Everyone believes I brought you here because you challenged me." Meredith remained quietly waiting. He finally turned to face her. They are wrong. He placed a thin folder in front of her. I brought you here because you were the only person in that room who was paying attention to something other than me. Meredith accepted the folder without opening it immediately. Instead, she watched Alistair Vaughn return to his desk where 3 computer monitors displayed financial reports, acquisition schedules, and international market updates. The office itself was surprisingly simple for one of the wealthiest men in America. There were no family photographs, no trophies, no expensive artwork chosen to impress visitors. Just clean lines, dark wood, floor-to-ceiling windows, and shelves filled with business books whose pages had clearly been used rather than displayed. The silence was interrupted only by the faint sound of rain tapping against the glass. Your responsibilities begin now, Alistair said without looking up. You will organize my calendar, review briefing materials before every meeting, and tell me when someone is wasting my time. Meredith raised an eyebrow. Even if that someone is you? He paused for a fraction of a second before continuing to read the document in front of him. Especially if that someone is me. It was the closest thing to humor she had heard from him. During the following days, Meredith discovered that nearly every rumor about the billionaire contained a small piece of truth, but none of them revealed the entire picture. He arrived before sunrise every morning. By 6 o'clock his office lights were already glowing above the city. He rarely ate breakfast. A cup of black coffee often sat untouched until it turned cold beside stacks of contracts waiting for his signature. Lunch appointments were almost always canceled because another meeting appeared on the calendar. Dinner usually became another conference call with overseas executives. The lights in his office remained on long after the rest of the building had emptied. One evening Meredith glanced at the clock before gathering her bag. It was almost 9:30. As she walked past his office, she noticed the same untouched coffee cup from that morning sitting beside a fresh one that had already grown cold. Alistair was still reviewing reports with the same unwavering focus. She knocked lightly on the open door. The cleaning crew is here. He nodded without lifting his eyes. Thank you. She hesitated. You have been working for more than 15 hours. 17. Have you eaten today? That is not on today's agenda. Meredith quietly disappeared into the employee lounge before returning a few minutes later with a bowl of hot tomato soup and a turkey sandwich from the cafeteria. She placed them gently on the corner of his desk. It is now. Alistair looked at the food as though he had forgotten meals were supposed to happen. I did not ask for this. No, Meredith replied calmly. Your schedule did not ask for sleep either, but I hope you eventually make time for that. Without waiting for an answer, she wished him a good night and left. The following morning she noticed the empty bowl sitting neatly beside the sink in the executive kitchenette. Nothing else was said. A pattern slowly emerged. Every employee addressed him exactly the same way. Sir. Mr. Vaughn. Chief Executive Officer. Nobody called him Alistair. Not board members. Not vice presidents. Not longtime colleagues, who had worked beside him since the company occupied a rented warehouse years earlier. It was as though the title had replaced the man. Meredith also noticed something else. Whenever someone entered his office, they immediately became tense. Their voices changed. Their shoulders stiffened. They rushed through presentations terrified of making the smallest mistake. Yet the moment they stepped outside, they relaxed and laughed with coworkers as though escaping a storm. One Friday afternoon Meredith found herself reviewing next week's travel schedule, while Alistair finished a video conference. As the screen went dark, he removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose for several quiet seconds. The exhaustion on his face appeared almost humanly fragile before the familiar mask returned. Meredith pretended not to notice, but the image remained with her. Later that evening she organized archived correspondence inside a storage cabinet connected to the executive office. Among years of neatly labeled files she found dozens of handwritten thank you notes from employees celebrating anniversaries, promotions, and successful projects. Every letter expressed gratitude for opportunities the company had provided. None had been opened. She carefully stacked them back into place and closed the drawer. For the first time since joining Vaughn Global, Meredith realized the loneliest person in the entire 48-story building was not the nervous intern, the overworked manager, or the recently transferred assistant. It was the billionaire whose office overlooked the whole city, yet who seemed to stand completely alone above it. Monday blended into Tuesday, and Tuesday disappeared into another demanding week inside Vaughn Global. Meredith Hale quickly learned that working beside Alistair Vaughn meant seeing parts of the company nobody else ever witnessed. Every contract crossed his desk. Every difficult decision eventually landed in his office. Every executive who entered carried confidence in and uncertainty out. Yet something had begun to change in small, almost invisible ways. Alistair no longer ignored the lunch she quietly placed on the corner of his desk. He still never thanked her directly, but the plates always came back empty. One afternoon she noticed him actually taking a break before another meeting instead of working straight through the afternoon. It lasted only 7 minutes, but for someone who measured life in productivity instead of moments, 7 minutes felt significant. Late on Thursday evening, Meredith remained behind to organize files before the next morning's board meeting. Rain once again painted soft lines across the windows while most of the building had already gone dark. She opened a cabinet searching for an old acquisition agreement, requested by the legal department. Instead, she discovered a row of thick archive boxes labeled with years rather than project names. One folder had slipped halfway out of place. As she reached to push it back, a newspaper clipping slid onto the shelf below. She picked it up carefully, intending only to return it. The headline immediately caught her attention. Vaughn Industries nearly collapses after emergency contract reversal. Beneath the headline was a photograph of a much younger Alistair standing beside an older gentleman whose proud smile mirrored his own. The article explained that 15 years earlier, before Vaughn Global existed, the family business had faced financial disaster after a major client unexpectedly canceled a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. According to the article, Alistair had personally recommended delaying legal action because hundreds of employees at the client's company would have lost their jobs. He believed cooperation would save both businesses. It did not. The client declared bankruptcy only weeks later. Vaughn Industries absorbed devastating losses. Banks withdrew support. Investors disappeared. Meredith quietly turned the page. Another article followed several months later. Founder Theodore Vaughn steps down due to health concerns. The accompanying photograph showed the same older man looking exhausted but still smiling beside his son. There were no dramatic details, only a brief statement that Theodore Vaughn had passed away not long afterward, leaving Alistair to rebuild what remained. Meredith slowly lowered the paper. She suddenly understood why compassion had become a word rarely spoken inside these walls. To Alistair, mercy had once carried an unbearable price. Before she could return the clipping, a calm voice came from behind her. "You found the only file in this office nobody was supposed to open." Meredith turned immediately. Alistair stood in the doorway without anger on his face. He simply looked tired. She carefully held out the article. "I am sorry. It slipped out by accident." He accepted the paper and stared at the faded photograph for several quiet seconds. "My father believed people deserved second chances." His voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "I agreed with him." Meredith remained silent. He continued looking at the newspaper instead of at her. "When the contract failed, more than half our employees lost their jobs. Families lost homes. Retirement savings disappeared. My father blamed himself because he trusted people who did not deserve it." He folded the clipping with slow, careful movements. "After he was gone, I made myself a promise." Meredith finally spoke. "Never let kindness interfere with business again." Alistair met her eyes. "Exactly." The office became quiet except for the distant sound of rain against the glass. Meredith could suddenly see how every impossible deadline, every sharp decision, every emotion carefully locked away had grown from one painful lesson repeated over 15 years. He had not built walls because he enjoyed controlling people. He had built them because he believed they protected everyone depending on him. She looked toward the dark skyline before returning her attention to him. "Your father believed in people," she said gently. "You believe in systems. Maybe neither one works perfectly without the other." Alistair said nothing. For the first time since they had met, however, he did not immediately dismiss her words. Instead, he carried the old newspaper back to his desk, placed it inside the folder, and quietly closed the drawer, as though sealing away a memory he had spent years refusing to revisit. The following Tuesday began with the quarterly strategy review, the one meeting every senior executive quietly dreaded. Representatives from every division filled the boardroom before sunrise, each carrying reports, forecasts, and carefully rehearsed presentations. Meredith sat near the end of the long table beside Alistair Vaughan, organizing briefing notes while watching familiar tension settle across the room. Nobody spoke unless invited. Nobody challenged an assumption. Every answer sounded polished, safe, and carefully measured. Halfway through the meeting, the head of product development presented an ambitious expansion plan. Colorful charts filled the screen, predicting record profits within 18 months. Executives nodded in agreement. Several board members smiled with satisfaction. The proposal appeared flawless until Alistair quietly began asking questions. How many independent suppliers confirmed these delivery dates? The executive hesitated. We estimated based on current trends. Estimated? Alistair asked. Not confirmed. The confidence in the room immediately faded. Not yet. How many contingency plans exist if the estimates fail? Silence answered him. Alistair leaned back in his chair without raising his voice. Then this proposal is incomplete. The executive lowered his eyes. Nobody defended the presentation. Nobody offered another perspective. Meredith looked around the table and realized everyone had already accepted the meeting's outcome before it actually happened. Ideas were no longer being tested. They were simply surviving. Alistair reached for the folder in front of him, clearly ready to move on to the next agenda item. Meredith felt the same uneasy feeling she had experienced during her first executive meeting. The company was about to repeat the same pattern. Fear would replace conversation. Opportunity would quietly disappear. Before she had time to reconsider, she spoke. You are wrong. Every face turned toward her so quickly that several people nearly dropped their pens. The room froze once again. More than one executive looked genuinely alarmed. One board member slowly removed his glasses as though he could not believe what he had just heard. Meredith remained perfectly calm. She was not challenging his authority. She was challenging the direction of the conversation. Alistair rested both hands on the table and looked directly at her. Nobody could predict what would happen next. Instead of dismissing her, he asked one simple question. Explain. The single word stunned the room even more than Meredith's interruption. She opened the presentation again and pointed toward one overlooked section. The proposal is incomplete, but not because these people are careless. They stopped asking difficult questions the moment they believed every imperfect answer would be treated as failure. Nobody wanted to admit uncertainty because uncertainty feels dangerous here. Nobody interrupted her. The market assumptions can still be verified. Alternative suppliers can still be identified. The strategy is not broken. The conversation is. A long silence followed. Meredith continued carefully. People produce their best work when they are expected to think, not simply expected to avoid mistakes. Alistair did not respond immediately. Instead, he slowly looked around the boardroom, studying the expressions he had stopped noticing years earlier. He saw executives avoiding eye contact. He saw talented leaders waiting for permission instead of offering insight. He saw exactly what Meredith had described. Fear had become more efficient than trust, but it had also become more expensive. Finally, he closed the presentation without rejecting it. We will reconvene tomorrow afternoon. Confused expressions spread across the room. Alistair continued. Before then, every department will challenge its own assumptions. I do not want polished answers. I want honest ones. Bring risks. Bring alternatives. Bring disagreements supported by evidence. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. This was not how meetings usually ended. As everyone slowly filed out of the room, whispers immediately followed them into the hallway. Meredith remained behind, organizing documents in thoughtful silence. Alistair approached the window overlooking the city before speaking quietly. Nobody has disagreed with me twice. Meredith smiled faintly. Maybe nobody believed you would listen. He looked at the streets far below where thousands of strangers hurried through another ordinary day. I was listening, he admitted after a long pause. I simply forgot that listening requires someone willing to speak honestly. Meredith gathered the remaining folders and placed them neatly on his desk. Neither of them realized it yet, but the culture of Vaughn Global had shifted by a fraction of an inch that morning, and sometimes the smallest change in direction is what eventually transforms an entire journey. By the end of the month, people throughout Vaughn Global had begun noticing changes they could not quite explain. Meetings were longer, but they produced better decisions. Department heads arrived carrying not only polished presentations but also honest questions. Employees who had once remained silent now contributed ideas backed by careful research. The atmosphere had not become casual. Alistair Vaughn still demanded excellence. Deadlines still mattered. Accountability still came first. But little by little, fear was losing its place to responsibility. Meredith Hale watched the transformation quietly from outside his office. She never claimed credit because she understood something important. Real change only lasted when people believed they had created it together. One Friday afternoon, the company hosted its annual Leadership Excellence Forum, an event attended by board members, senior executives, investors, and division managers from across the country. More than 400 guests gathered inside the auditorium on the lower level of headquarters. The event celebrated innovation, growth, and the company's future. Every presentation had been rehearsed for weeks. Every detail reflected the flawless reputation Vaughn Global had built. Meredith moved between backstage hallways with her tablet, making certain speakers remained on schedule. Alistair was preparing the closing address while reviewing final notes in a private conference room. Everything appeared perfectly organized until an unexpected interruption changed the mood. Victor Langford, one of the company's oldest board members and a respected investor, approached Meredith with a polite smile that never reached his eyes. "Miss Hale," he said smoothly, "it seems remarkable that someone who joined the company only weeks ago now influences decisions inside the executive office." Meredith answered with the same calm professionalism she always maintained. "I support the chief executive officer by doing my job." Victor chuckled softly. "Is that what we are calling it now?" Several nearby executives heard the comment and quietly stopped walking. Victor continued before anyone could respond. "Many experienced leaders have spent years earning Mr. Vaughn's confidence. Yet somehow a young assistant has become the voice he listens to most. People naturally begin asking questions." Meredith recognized what he was doing. He was planting doubt where trust had only just begun to grow. She could have walked away. She could have defended herself emotionally. Instead, she smiled with quiet confidence. "Questions are healthy," she replied. "Assumptions are usually the problem." Victor folded his arms. "Then perhaps you can explain what qualifies you to influence billion-dollar decisions." Meredith met his gaze without hesitation. "I do not influence billion-dollar decisions. I ask questions when everyone else becomes afraid to ask them. The decisions still belong to Mr. Vaughn." A small crowd had gathered nearby. Conversations faded as people sensed the exchange becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Victor looked around the room before speaking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Or perhaps the chief executive officer has simply become too dependent on one employee's opinions. Before Meredith could answer, another voice entered the conversation. "No." The single word carried calmly across the hallway. Every head turned toward Alistair as he stepped out of the conference room. He walked toward the gathering without rushing, his expression composed as always. Victor offered a diplomatic smile. "We were merely discussing leadership." "Then let us discuss it honestly," Alistair replied. He stopped beside Meredith instead of in front of her, making it unmistakably clear they stood on the same side. "For years I believed leadership meant having every answer. Miss Hale reminded me that leadership also requires asking better questions." The hallway became completely silent. Alistair continued. "She has never told me what decision to make. She has simply refused to let fear replace honesty. That is not weakness. That is integrity." Victor attempted another objection. "Surely experience matters more than courage." Alistair nodded thoughtfully. "Experience teaches us what has already happened. Courage allows us to see what could happen next. A company that values only experience eventually stops growing." Several executives exchanged surprised looks. They had never heard him speak this way before. He turned toward Meredith briefly before addressing everyone gathered in the hallway. From this day forward, no employee at Von Global will be criticized for respectfully challenging an idea supported by facts and good judgment. If we expect innovation, then we must also welcome honest disagreement. The announcement spread through the audience faster than any presentation that afternoon. Meredith felt hundreds of eyes upon her. Yet for the first time since joining the company, she no longer felt like the newest assistant in the building. She felt like someone whose quiet courage had been seen, protected, and publicly respected by the one man everyone once believed incapable of doing exactly that. The Leadership Excellence Forum ended with standing applause, but the conversation it started continuing throughout Von Global for weeks. Employees who had once measured every sentence now volunteered ideas during meetings. Managers began inviting younger team members to challenge assumptions instead of merely accepting instructions. Meredith Hale noticed the difference in countless small moments. People smiled more often in the hallways. Office doors remained open a little longer. Even the executive floor felt less like a museum of silence, and more like a place where thoughtful conversation could exist without fear. Alistair Vaughn noticed it too, although he rarely admitted it aloud. One evening after most employees had gone home, he handed Meredith a sealed envelope before leaving for an investor dinner. "Please review tomorrow's briefing package," he said. "There is one document inside that requires your attention." Meredith nodded and waited until she returned to her desk before opening the envelope. Along with several financial reports, she found an approval letter from the Von Global Community Foundation. At first she assumed it belonged to one of the company's charitable programs. Then she recognized the address. It belonged to the rehabilitation clinic where her mother had completed months of physical therapy after a serious car accident nearly 2 years earlier. Meredith frowned in confusion. Attached to the letter was a receipt showing every remaining medical balance had been paid in full through an anonymous corporate grant. Another document confirmed that the educational loan Meredith had struggled to repay since college had also been quietly purchased and forgiven through a scholarship initiative funded by the same foundation. Her hands became perfectly still. She had never applied for either program. She carefully searched for another explanation until she reached the final page. There was no personal note, no signature, only an internal authorization code approved directly by the Office of the Chief Executive Officer. The next morning Meredith entered Alistair's office carrying the folder. He was already reviewing market reports while sunlight reflected across the skyline behind him. She gently placed the documents on his desk. "You knew." He looked up without pretending not to understand. "Yes. Why did you never tell me?" Alistair leaned back quietly before answering. "Because gratitude was never the objective." Meredith searched his face for an explanation that made sense. "You paid my mother's medical bills." He nodded once. "The foundation did. You approved it." Another brief silence followed. "Yes." Meredith struggled to find the right words. "You also eliminated my student loans. You earned that education. Debt should not erase its value." She looked at him in disbelief. "How long have you known about my family?" "Since Human Resources completed your employment file." Meredith lowered her eyes. "You could have told me." "If I had," he answered softly, "every conversation afterward would have been influenced by obligation instead of honesty. I wanted to know whether the person who challenged me in that conference room was genuine, not grateful." She understood then that every decision had been made without expecting recognition. The realization somehow made the gesture even more meaningful. After another quiet moment, Alistair walked toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. "There is something else you deserve to know." Meredith joined him near the glass. He watched the city below before continuing. "When you said enough during your first meeting, I almost asked security to escort you from the building." Meredith smiled faintly. "I assumed that was a possibility." Then you looked at the project manager who had just left the room. His voice remained calm, but noticeably warmer than before. "You were not defending yourself. You were defending someone who could no longer defend himself." That was the moment I realized I had surrounded myself with intelligent people who had forgotten how to speak honestly. He turned toward her. "You did not change this company because you were fearless. You changed it because you cared more about what was right than what was comfortable. Meredith felt the weight of his words settle quietly between them. I only reminded people of something they already had. Alistair smiled for the first time without restraint. It was small, almost uncertain, but completely genuine. No, he said gently. You reminded me of something I thought I had lost 15 years ago. Autumn arrived with clear skies over New York, but inside Von Global another storm was quietly forming. A multinational competitor launched an aggressive takeover attempt, offering enormous premiums to shareholders while spreading rumors that Von Global had become less disciplined under its current leadership. Financial news channels repeated the same narrative throughout the week. Investors demanded immediate answers. Several board members privately questioned whether Alistair Von had become too focused on culture instead of performance. Emergency meetings filled every hour of the executive calendar. Meredith Hale watched pressure settle across the building. Once again, but this time the atmosphere felt different. Employees were worried, yet they continued speaking openly. They continued questioning assumptions. They continued working together instead of retreating into silence. The change they had built was being tested. During one critical strategy session, Victor Langford presented a proposal that immediately captured the attention of several directors. The market wants certainty, he declared. Announce immediate restructuring. Freeze employee development programs. Reduce community investments. Eliminate anything that appears sentimental. We remind shareholders that Von Global is driven by results, not emotions. A few executives quietly nodded. On paper, the proposal promised short-term confidence. Meredith studied the financial projections before gently raising her hand. These numbers improve 1 quarter, she said carefully, but they weaken innovation over the next 3 years. Victor smiled politely. That is an optimistic opinion. Meredith remained calm. It is supported by our own internal research. Before she could continue, Victor looked directly at Alistair. You have an important decision to make. Protect your reputation as the strongest leader in this industry, or continue following advice that investors already question. The room became silent. Every eye shifted toward the chief executive officer. Months earlier, everyone believed they already knew how he would respond. He would protect authority at any cost. He would distance himself from the newest employee. He would choose image over relationship. Instead, Alistair slowly stood and walked toward the presentation screen. He removed Victor's proposal and replaced it with employee engagement reports, customer satisfaction surveys, and long-term growth forecasts collected over the previous year. The market believes discipline and compassion cannot exist together, he said evenly. The data proves otherwise. He looked around the room before continuing. Our strongest product launches came from teams encouraged to challenge assumptions. Employee retention reached its highest level in 8 years after we changed how leaders communicate. Customer loyalty increased because innovation improved. Those results are measurable. Victor attempted one final objection. Shareholders expect toughness. Alistair nodded. They deserve wisdom. He turned toward Meredith without hesitation. Miss Hale was correct. We will not sacrifice our future to protect appearances today. The decision surprised even the directors who had begun supporting the new culture. After the meeting ended, several executives quietly thanked Meredith for defending the long-term vision, but she knew the greater moment had belonged to Alistair. He had publicly chosen conviction over convenience. That evening the executive floor grew quiet as employees headed home. Meredith finished organizing reports before preparing to leave. She found Alistair standing beside the same window where countless difficult conversations had taken place over the past several months. The city lights reflected across the glass while traffic moved like streams of gold below. Without turning around, he spoke softly. Do you remember the first word you ever said to me? Meredith smiled. I remember wondering whether I would still have a job afterward. A quiet laugh escaped him, surprising them both. I spent years believing leadership meant carrying every burden alone. He finally faced her. Then you walked into a conference room and reminded me that strength without trust eventually becomes isolation. Meredith lowered her eyes for a moment before meeting his gaze again. You were the one who chose to change. He shook his head gently. No. You simply gave me permission to become the leader my father always hoped I would be." For several peaceful seconds neither of them spoke. No titles filled the silence. No board members waited outside the door. No billion-dollar negotiations demanded immediate attention. There were only two people who had slowly transformed one another through honesty, respect, and quiet courage. Somewhere between impossible deadlines, difficult conversations, and countless ordinary mornings, admiration had grown into something deeper, something neither of them had planned and neither of them was ready to ignore any longer. Nearly 1 year passed before anyone inside Von Global truly understood how much had changed. The company emerged stronger from the attempted takeover than analysts had predicted. Revenue reached new records. Employee retention became the highest in company history. Industry publications praised the culture that many critics had once dismissed as impossible. Visitors who walked through headquarters noticed something different immediately. People still worked hard. Standards remained high. But the silence that had once filled the executive floor had disappeared. Ideas moved as freely as people. Questions were welcomed instead of feared. On the anniversary of the Leadership Excellence Forum, every employee gathered inside the company's grand auditorium for the annual town hall meeting. Thousands of faces filled the room while hundreds more joined through live broadcasts from offices across the country. Large screens displayed the words "Building the Future Together." Meredith Hale stood near the side of the stage reviewing the final schedule one last time. Although she now served as Director of Executive Strategy, she still preferred standing behind the scenes, helping others succeed instead of seeking attention for herself. She smiled as employees laughed together before the presentation began. A year earlier that simple sound would have been almost unimaginable inside Von Global. The lights gradually dimmed as Alistair Vaughan stepped onto the stage. The applause lasted nearly a full minute before finally settling into respectful silence. He looked across the audience without immediately opening the prepared speech resting on the podium. Instead, he quietly closed the folder and set it aside. "A year ago," he began, "I believed leadership meant having every answer before anyone asked a question. I believed the strongest leader was the one nobody dared challenge." The room remained completely still. "I was wrong." The words echoed through the auditorium with remarkable simplicity. Employees exchanged surprised smiles. Investors seated in the front rows listened with quiet curiosity. Alistair continued. "The turning point did not happen because of a billion-dollar contract. It did not happen because of an acquisition or a market victory. It happened because one person cared enough to tell me something nobody else would." He looked toward the side of the stage where Meredith stood, clearly unprepared for what came next. "Meredith," he said warmly, "would you please join me?" She hesitated for only a moment before walking onto the stage. The audience welcomed her with spontaneous applause that grew louder with every step. Alistair waited until she reached him before speaking again. The first complete sentence she ever directed at me contained only one important word. He smiled gently. "Enough." Laughter mixed with applause throughout the auditorium. At the time I thought she was challenging my authority. I eventually realized she was protecting something much more valuable than my pride. She was protecting the courage of every person in this company. Meredith looked at him with quiet emotion while thousands of employees watched the moment unfold. Alistair reached into his jacket pocket and carefully removed a small velvet box. A wave of surprised whispers spread across the room. He turned toward her, not as a billionaire speaking to an employee, but as one human being speaking honestly to another. "You reminded me that kindness is not weakness. You reminded me that trust creates stronger leaders than fear ever could. Most importantly, you reminded me that success means very little if there is nobody beside you to share it." He opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring that reflected the stage lights without unnecessary extravagance. "Meredith Hale, you helped me change this company by changing the man who believed it could never change. Will you spend the rest of your life continuing that journey with me?" Tears gathered in Meredith's eyes as she smiled through quiet laughter. "Yes," she answered softly. "Absolutely yes." The auditorium erupted into applause louder than any celebration in the company's history. Colleagues who had once feared speaking freely now stood cheering together. Victor Langford smiled from the front row and joined the standing ovation, acknowledging that the future he had doubted had become reality. Months later, beneath a clear spring sky in a quiet garden surrounded by family, close friends, and employees who had become something much closer than co-workers, Alistair and Meredith exchanged vows built on honesty instead of perfection. Inside the entrance to Vaughn Global headquarters, visitors now passed a bronze plaque engraved with a single word that had transformed an entire company. Enough. Beneath it appeared another simple sentence that every new employee read on the first day of work. The strongest leaders are not the ones nobody dares question. They are the ones courageous enough to listen. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who believes in love, kindness, and second chances, and subscribe to Chosen by Love for more emotional billionaire romance stories. Your support helps us keep creating powerful stories where courage changes lives and love chooses the unexpected.